Welcome to Secret Story. The following story is mostly true and retold to the best of my memory. Of course, this did take place a few years ago, so I have no doubt that I might have forgotten a few details. Still, I'll try my best to retell it just as I experienced it. As a favor to you, I'll skip over the boring parts of this story. No one wants to know about how many times you sharpen a pencil during an exam or how many answers you erased and rewrote. People just want to know what your final score was. So this is one of the craziest stories of my life, although there are many, in a nutshell that I was just your average young guy. Yep, that pretty much summed me up. I was in my final year of college and hot for any piece of tail I could get. Even though I did score a few times with some of the girls on campus, it was honestly nothing memorable or worth its own glorious story. That all changed when I met Rachel. Rachel was the one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen. Long brown hair, beautiful big eyes, a pretty smile. Not one specific feature was the best. It was all just perfectly balanced. I got to fully score. You see, Rachel still lived at home with her parents and they were very, rightfully, protective of her. Not that I blame them. Rachel was a very desirable young woman. So in order to spend more time with her, I had to become good friends with the family since she wouldn't or couldn't spend the night at my place. After a few months I was over at her house meeting the family. It was just her parents as her younger sister was off at some private school. Really an all-American family, I guess. Her dad Bob was an airline pilot. He had the classic look of a professional, looked tough but was fairly cool. Her mom Joan was a stay-at-home mom. Joan was about 40 at the time. She had long blonde hair, dyed, I could see some of the darker roots, and was really in great shape. Slim, attractive, and I could see right away where Rachel got her awesome shape from. I spent more and more time over there, and after about a month of me hanging out all the time, I was finally invited to spend the night instead of driving back to my dorm on the weekend. Rachel's mom Joan insisted that I stay over one Friday night, and that way I could just hang out with them at the pool the next morning. I told her I didn't even bring a swimsuit, and she said I could just use one of Bob's older ones. He was going to be out the next day anyway. I was hoping that with her dad out of town I could steal some private time with Rachel that night, but they gave me the couch in the living room. I only wish I could have crawled into bed with Rachel, but no such luck. Joan brought me a pillow and a blanket and joked that there shouldn't be any sleepwalking during the night. That next morning I woke up and it took me a few minutes to figure out where I was. After the morning fog on my brain lifted, I quickly remembered that I had stayed over at Rachel's and was on the couch in the living room. What had woken me was Joan in the kitchen making breakfast. I bet she was making her famous pancakes. Great. What I noticed next wasn't so great. I had taken my shirt off before I went to sleep, and obviously I had managed to get the rest of my clothes off too during the night. But to make matters worse, the blanket I was using had fallen off onto the floor as well. Just as I was realizing this, Joan walked from the kitchen into the living room to check on me. So I was in a fix. I didn't know what Joan was going to say and I didn't know how to react. I half expected her to scream in terror or run from the room to get her husband Bob. It turns out that Bob was normally out of town each weekend. After about 5 seconds that seemed to stretch on forever, I realized she thought I was still asleep, so I just went with that plan and laid perfectly still with my eyes mostly closed. Joan just stared at it and said nothing. She then walked to the other side of the living room and disappeared down the hall. I wasn't sure what she was going to do, but evidently she was just checking to see if anyone else was up yet. A few seconds later I heard her return footsteps. Did she get Rachel out of bed to deal with it? I had no clue what to expect, but my only game plan was to fake being asleep and deny knowing about it. She walked softly back over to the couch where I lay, pretending to be fast asleep. Joan reached her hand out and tapped me on the shoulder softly. I didn't move. She then put her hand on my leg and whispered my name quietly, and of course I just laid there and tried to breathe evenly as though I were fast asleep. My first thought was, crap, her hand is cold. covered me back up with the blanket that was on the floor and walked back to the kitchen. I was both disappointed and relieved at the same time. Okay, so the sight of me didn't terrify her. Obviously she found it very attractive. Once Joan was back in the kitchen, she called out my name loudly and said she was making breakfast, and that I should get up and get a shower if I wanted any hot water, 'cause once Rachel got up she'd use it all for sure. Joan stuck her head around the corner and I pretended to yawn and stretch as though I just woke up. I said, "Oh, good morning, Joan. I slept like a baby on this couch. It's sure comfy." Joan said, "That's great. It actually makes out into a bed, but it's so comfy I fall asleep on it myself all the time just like it is." Joan turned back around and began washing something in the sink. I now had another issue to deal with. Joan was still moving about the kitchen, and depending on where she was standing, she could see the living room or the hallway that led to the guest bath. I'd probably be seen either way as soon as I took the cover off. Based on what she had done just a moment ago, I guessed that she wouldn't be terrified seeing me, but still I didn't have any idea what was going through her mind. I finally reasoned that Joan could only assume that I wasn't concerned unless I gave a hint that this freaked me out, so I just stood up, picked up my clothes and headed off towards the bathroom without trying to cover anything. Out of the corner of my eye I could see that Joan had turned around and was watching me. Just to push my luck I stopped before closing the bathroom door and asked Joan which towels I should use. Joan walked down to the bathroom from the kitchen. She came just inside the doorway and stopped and looked at me and then down. "Oh, I'm sorry," I said, pretending to be slightly embarrassed. Joan just blushed, said, "Yeah, happens to Bob sometimes too. Who knows why that happens?" Joan then pointed to a stack of towels on the side of the sink. "Thanks," I said. I concocted another excuse for her to linger. "Is there any special soap I should use, or do I just use what's already in the shower?" I scooted back to give Joan more room and she walked across the bathroom, opened the shower curtain and peeked into the shower. "Just use whatever is in there, dear," said Joan. She turned, smiled, and she paused as if she was about to say something. The silence was awkward. I bailed her out by handing her my shirt and asked, "Can you throw that in the dryer for me for a few min, please? To get the wrinkles you." I stepped into the shower and turned the water on. "Can you just set it back on the sink when it's done? I'll leave the door unlocked for you." Why on earth did I say that? I was relieved to hear Joan say, "Sure dear, and I'll get your jeans too." She walked out, shutting the door behind her. That I don't know how well I got the rest of me clean, but I jacked off furiously in the shower after Joan stepped out. That I turned the water off, dried off and stepped out onto the bath mat. There was a soft knock on the door and I said, "Come in," knowing it had to be Joan. Joan opened the door and took a couple steps into the bathroom. "Here's your shirt and jeans, all fresh and wrinkle-free." Joan started to turn and walk out, and then she stopped and said, "I see you fixed your morning problem now." "Oh, yeah," I said with a big grin on my face. Joan woke Rachel after I got out of the shower, and then she poured us a cup of coffee and we both sat down and watched the morning news while we waited for Rachel to get out of the bathroom. We just sat there quietly for a while and Joan finally broke the silence. "So just how serious are you and Rachel?" I assured her that Rachel was the most amazing girl I'd ever known. She went on, "I just was thinking after this morning. I was thinking that we shared a rather intimate moment." Joan blushed slightly. "But a close casual moment, as if you were family, and I just wanted to be sure that you were serious about her if we're going to treat you like close family." I looked at Joan and said, "Can I ask you to keep a secret? I think you might have an idea what I'm talking about." Joan swallowed hard and looked at me. The look on her face said she was busted, that I knew what she did to me. "Sure," said Joan, "we can have a secret that no one else has to know about." "Joan, you have to promise not to tell Rachel about this." Joan looked at me and just nodded. "Joan, I know." I paused just to prolong her torture. "I know you must have an idea about how strongly I feel about Rachel, and I'm fairly certain she's the one for me. You might actually be family if things work out the way I want them to." Joan's mouth dropped and then a huge look of relief washed over her face. But you have to promise me you won't tell Rachel. I want to surprise her this fall with a proposal. Joan said, of course, I wouldn't want to spoil that. I'll keep it a secret that only we know. Joan then said, you want to hear something funny? I thought you were going to say something about me seeing you into the bathroom this morning. Joan laughed nervously. That I laughed and said, oh that? No, I didn't think anything of that. I'm sorry that I was too dumb to find the towels that were right in front of me. Don't worry about it, said Joan. We both laughed and then I said, yeah, we should probably keep that between us two. Someone might not understand. Joan nodded in agreement. That knowledge could come in handy later. Rachel came out of the shower about that time and said, I hope you two are getting along okay. We both said yeah, just watching news and chatting about nothing. Joan winked at me again. Joan then served us some of the best pancakes I've ever had and we all chatted as if nothing odd had happened that morning. Just before lunch I volunteered to go out and take care of the lawn. It wasn't in terrible need of attention but it gave me something to do while I waited for everyone else to get ready for the day. It was getting hot out by the time I finished and I was really looking forward to hanging out by the pool with Rachel. I sort of hoped that her mom would join us outside as well. After lunch Rachel said she wanted to go outside and use the pool in the backyard and invited me and Joan to come out and join her. I do my best to impress. I said that I went back to Joan's room and knocked on the door. Come on in, Joan said. I told her that Rachel said I could borrow an old pair of her dad's swim trunks. Joan said, why don't you take a quick shower and throw those on? I went back to the guest bathroom and since Rachel was outside I decided to leave the door open to see if Joan would wander in again for any reason. I was disappointed when she didn't show up but she did come into the bathroom while I was in the shower and said that she'd wash my clothes while we were out at the pool. I asked her, aren't you going to join us, Joan? She said she thought about it but wasn't sure but I insisted that she come out with us. I told her, Rachel said she picked a swimsuit out for you and that she'd be really sad if you don't come out with us. Joan finally agreed to and went off to her room to change. Get me to thinking but not with the head on my shoulders of course. I'll see what I can do, I said. But this better not be a test to see if I'll hit on your mom. Rachel just laughed and said, no I want you to. That's the idea. Rachel winked at me then nodded towards her mom. I looked up and Joan was adjusting her pool lounge. Rachel smiled and said, see that's the spirit. After about 30 minutes of sitting out everyone was getting hot so we all jumped into the pool. Rachel was true to her word. Joan got in at the other side of the pool. Rachel nudged me in that direction. Don't let her hang out over there on her own. I'm getting back out but you should swim over there and talk to her. Flirt with her a little too. I watched as Rachel got out of the pool. I swam over to the shallow end where Joan was lounging. I chatted about the heat for a minute and noticed she was still a bit uncomfortable. Hey Joan, don't be shy. Joan sat up a little bit more and said, I'm still not sure about them. I don't know if they look or feel realistic. Joan said, okay sure. It would be nice to get another opinion. Joan stood up in the pool and walked right up to me. Joan laughed and said, you're both crazy, I wouldn't know they were implants if you didn't tell me. Really? Joan said, we stayed like that for the rest of the afternoon. I swam across the pool a couple of times and then hopped out. Joan noticed that Rachel was still gone and remarked, hey I saw you this morning. We both laughed and I said, who me? Joan said, may I? I saw out of the corner of my eye that Rachel had come back out. Joan, I said. Joan looked at me with a sly smile that I looked at Joan and said, don't be coy. I know morning while I was sleeping. Joan stopped and looked at me. You were awake. Well not really at first, I said, why don't you finish what you started this morning? Joan hadn't noticed that Rachel was standing in the doorway watching since Rachel was behind her to the left. Okay, said Joan. Just don't tell Rachel. I looked over at Rachel and said, I promise, I won't say a word to her about this. Rachel saw I looked over at Rachel, who smiled and mouthed, I love you. Obviously she was under the impression that I was doing this out of duty to Rachel. I doubt I would have taken it this far without Rachel's prodding, but I have to admit I was doing this for selfish reasons as well. Well, what do you know? I looked over at Rachel, who was fingering herself even faster and mouthed, perfect, while giving me the thumbs up. I looked over and saw that Rachel had collapsed into a sitting position on the ground by the door. Joan looked back towards the door but couldn't see Rachel cause she was still sitting and the back of the chair was in the way. Joan said, we need to clean up before Rachel comes back with the drinks. Joan smiled and said, I'd like that very much. I can't promise every time you sleep over, but if Bob is out of town, and he has most weekends. I said, deal. I hesitated. I wouldn't want to hurt Rachel's feelings. If she's wanting me to wait, then. I hugged Joan close and looked over her shoulder at Rachel. Rachel shrugged, nodded her head vigorously and mouthed, yes, yes, why not? We were both in the pool when Rachel walked back out. Rachel was smiling from ear to ear. I see you two are still out here having fun. Did I miss anything? Joan said, no. We hung out in the pool for a while longer. Later that night Rachel did sneak into the living room, and when I was trying to drill Rachel was drilling me with questions about what she overheard at the pool. Rachel said, you're the one for sure then, but I already knew that. Afterwards she said, you need to keep Mom's spirits up. God knows Dad isn't doing it. I'm going to keep pretending that I don't know. Rachel kissed me and said, then better. If that's all it takes to keep my mom happy, I'm more than willing to share you. Don't tell her I know though. I think she sort of likes that she does it to you secretly. That next morning when Rachel finally got up, she raised her eyebrow during breakfast and said, so. Rachel said, you poor man. Better eat a good breakfast. 1 year later, thanks Joan. Joan said, don't mention it. And you two have fun on our honeymoon. Rachel caught me her mom in the kitchen last year after Thanksgiving dinner. Joan tried to hide, but Rachel said, really Mom? I've known my for years. Joan couldn't believe it. Really? Yes Mom. And guess what? We just found out we're pregnant. I'm going to need you to take extra care of my hubby for the next 9 months. You might have to do more than the occasional weekend. Rachel winked, and her mom smiled. Every other day. Do you think he can handle it? I hope so, Mom. Finish what you started there. Joan proved once again that she really was the best mother-in-law.